Before we get started, take a second to get comfortable. Dim the lights, settle in, and if you're enjoying these quiet dives into the past, consider subscribing, but only if you feel like it. Maybe leave a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always amazing to see where in the world you're tuning in. Now take a deep breath, and let's drift back in time together. Being a king in medieval Europe might sound like a dream. Power, riches, a throne, and the final word on every matter. It's easy to imagine silken robes, feasts in candlelit halls, and a kingdom hanging on your every word. But peel back the velvet curtain, and you'll find something far less glamorous. Because while the crown glittered, the life underneath it was heavy, rigid, and often incredibly uncomfortable. Kingship was not a life of ease. It was an unrelenting grind wrapped in ritual and responsibility. Let's start at the very beginning, just before dawn. You don't wake up gently in a medieval palace. There's no sunlight streaming through linen curtains, no hot bath drawn for you. The rooms are cold. The stone walls sweat with moisture. The fire in the hearth burned out hours ago, and the only warmth you have is the fur blanket twisted around your legs. Your chamber smells faintly of smoke, damp cloth, and old wood. It's quiet, except for the occasional echo of footsteps in distant halls and the rustle of servants already at work. Before your eyes are even fully open, someone's already knocking. Your chamberlain, a mix between a personal assistant, a major domo, and a ceremonial scheduler, is announcing that the day has begun. He's not being rude, he's doing his job, because as king, your time is never yours. From the moment you wake, you belong to the machinery of the crown. You rise from bed, not at leisure, but because there's a lineup of duties waiting. The crown doesn't allow for sleeping in. You might stretch, maybe groan, but soon enough you're sitting upright, feet on cold stone, and someone is dressing you. Shirt, hose, tunic, boots, a belt, a pouch. Maybe your signet ring. If it's winter, another layer or two. A servant helps with each item while someone else recites your schedule. Meetings with the royal council, judgments to pass, disputes between nobles to settle, petitions from merchants, a military briefing, a religious ceremony at the cathedral, perhaps even an urgent letter from a neighboring monarch that demands a reply before noon. You eat while standing, or walking, or reading correspondence. No eggs and toast, no coffee, just cold bread, maybe some preserved meat or cheese, and a gulp of watered-down wine or ale. You're not feasting. This is fuel. It's something to keep your stomach from grumbling while you hear a dispute between two barons arguing over grazing rights, or while your scribe reads out the latest grain shortage reports from the eastern shires. And remember, this is all before the real decisions begin. Because being a medieval king wasn't just about looking the part. It meant managing a volatile system of loyalty, inheritance, war, famine, disease, and the constant risk of rebellion. Every choice mattered. Every slight had consequences. Every delay could spark unrest. Behind the titles and ceremonies was a constant undercurrent of tension. One noble's discontent could lead to civil war. One misspoken word at court could ripple into years of distrust. You didn't rule with absolute power. You ruled with fragile influence, granted by God in theory, but held in place by a web of promises, alliances, feudal contracts, blood ties, and the constant need to prove you deserved the crown sitting on your head. Fail to inspire loyalty, and the throne beneath you could vanish like mist. Your authority was only as strong as your ability to keep powerful men satisfied, the clergy on your side, and your people from starving. And all of this? This is just the morning, just the opening act in a day that will stretch into the night with councils, feasts, prayers, ceremonies, and more decisions. There's no room for weakness, no room for indecision. Only the crown, and everything that comes with it. The morning might have started in a chill, but by mid-morning, the palace is already alive and tense. Not with joy or music or laughter, but with duty, urgency, and unspoken consequences. Advisors gather in the main hall beneath high vaulted ceilings that echo every footstep. Pages race through narrow, drafty corridors with parchment rolled in trembling hands, carrying royal commands as if they were fire. Servants don't need a clock to know the hour. They feel it in their bones. And you, the king, sit at the center of it all. You are not a man this morning. You are the weight every other breath depends on. The royal council assembles promptly, a ritual so common it's practically muscle memory, yet never routine. The air in the chamber tightens as each member takes their seat around the long oaken table. The chancellor clutches scrolls inked with tax burdens and supply shortages. The marshal of the army, still dusted with stable grit, smells of iron and leather. The bishop speaks softly, quoting scripture with precision, his ringed hands folded just so. A cousin, perhaps, or a brother, someone you trust just enough to tolerate, leans in with the kind of smile that masks ambition. They are polite, respectful, and absolutely dangerous. Their words are measured, their silences strategic. This is not discussion, it's combat in velvet. Your role? Listen without leaning, nod with gravity, speak only when silence would cost too much. There's a famine curling like smoke through the western villages. A volatile border dispute in the north threatens to flare. A noble has raised his own banners, too high, too soon. The marshal wants coin, the treasury echoes. You cannot afford to pause. A single wrong sentence might start a rebellion. A hesitant look might embolden the wrong ally. Everything you say echoes past this room. When the council ends, judgment begins. Petitioners line the hall, waiting for your gaze. Merchants, peasants, landowners, knights. They kneel, they bow, they plead. Justice, restitution, clemency, gold. Each case requires memory, instinct, and careful calculation. You cannot forget that the knight begging pardon once saved your life in battle, or that the merchant has powerful friends. You must cut through lies wrapped in grief. You must deliver mercy that still inspires fear. Favor is dangerous. Mercy is not free. And through it all, your every gesture is recorded, if not in ink, then in whispered rumor. If you blink too often, they'll say you're ill. If you laugh too easily, they'll say you've gone soft. If you pause too long, they'll say someone else is pulling your strings. In this world, the man is the myth, and the myth is constantly being rewritten. There is no respite in prayer, only performance. You walk to the cathedral, your feet echoing over stones, trod by ancestors and ghosts. The bishop welcomes you beneath golden arches, incense curling in spirals through shafts of cold light. You kneel, you stand, you cross yourself. The prayers last too long. The words wash over you without soaking in. This is less about God and more about reminding everyone that your authority answers only to heaven. By early afternoon, it's time to correspond. Your scribe sits beside you with an inkwell and steady hands. Letters arrive from across the continent. A foreign monarch wants to seal a betrothal. A baron warns of strange omens in the east. Your spies whisper of secret meetings in smoky inns. You dictate responses while calculating tone, implication, and ripple. A friendly word might be taken as a sign of weakness. A sharp one might close doors you aren't ready to close. Paper is lighter than steel, but its cut is often deeper. Meanwhile, the palace breathes. Dogs bark in distant chambers. Guards shift at the doors. Maids pass like shadows through corridors. Horses stamp and whinny outside. Servants trade gossip as they carry trays and scrolls. You hear none of it directly, yet feel it all. The kingdom doesn't pause. It pulls you with it every moment. Your day stretches not with grandeur but with gravity. Every decision binds you tighter to the throne. You don't recline on silk cushions or sip imported wine in gilded silence. You navigate power like a soldier moves through a battlefield, aware, cautious, relentless. The crown sits on your head, but the real weight presses down through your spine, into your breath, your thoughts, your choices. And the sun is still rising. Evening hasn't even begun to cast its long shadows through the stained glass windows. The hardest hours are still ahead. By late afternoon, the palace begins to hum with a different rhythm, not slower but more focused. sharper around the edges. The sun slants lower in the sky, and the light through the tall, arched windows softens, casting long blades of gold across the cold stone floors. But the burdens of kingship do not fade with the day. If anything, they grow heavier. This is the hour when fatigue creeps in, when tempers fray quietly, and when small missteps can ignite long-burning consequences. You are led through echoing halls to the private audience chamber. It's a smaller space compared to the Grand Council room, but no less ceremonial in its decor and tone. Here, the air is thick with unspoken deals and centuries of precedent. These are not meetings for show. These are the crucial, behind-the-scenes conversations that hold the kingdom together, or, if mismanaged, pull it apart. A noble requests your approval for a land grant that would tilt regional power in his favor. A bishop leans in with a whisper about internal corruption, offering unflinching loyalty in exchange for discretion. An emissary from a bordering kingdom brings you a gift, speaks with charm, but you know each pleasantry masks a subtle test, a warning dressed in politeness. This is the part of kingship that wears you down most, where the true danger lies, not in open rebellion or foreign armies, but in delicate words and untraceable motives. No one raises their voice. Everyone smiles. But the stakes are blood and borders. You must listen between the lines, read the hesitations in speech, watch how someone grips their goblet or shifts in their chair. This is not conversation. It's combat with velvet gloves. You do not dine yet. Not properly. Perhaps you nibble on a bit of aged cheese, a slice of apple, a sip of wine diluted with water. Just enough to steady your nerves, not enough to dull them. Hunger, in moderation, is a weapon. It sharpens the senses. And your survival depends on your senses staying razor sharp. As twilight creeps across the horizon, the royal scribes arrive with documents requiring your attention. There are treaties to affirm, decrees to authorize, pardons to consider. Each scroll demands your full focus, even as your body begs for rest. You force your tired eyes to scan the words. You know a single overlooked phrase or misplaced name can trigger a feud between houses or unravel months of careful diplomacy. Mistakes made now, in the last hours of the day, when concentration falters, are often the most costly. You sign with deliberate precision. Your royal seal leaves its impression in hot wax. Somewhere far from this room, a village may celebrate the arrival of new roads, or a nobleman may grind his teeth at a denied request. Your decisions echo far beyond the room, carried by messengers, whispered in halls, recorded in ink and memory alike. And still, the day is not over. As true darkness begins to pool in the shadowed corners of the palace, the tone shifts once again. The sounds of music begin to stir. A tentative lute plucked in a side chamber, a harp tuning slowly. The preparations for the evening feast are underway. Courtiers and guests begin to drift into the great hall, dressed no longer in somber attire, but in velvet, satin, and the polished shine of wealth. Jewels glint under torchlight. Smiles are bright, eyes sharper. This is diplomacy masquerading as festivity. The evening is no break. It's another stage, another kind of performance. You, the king, must shift roles yet again, smiling, laughing, engaging in small talk that carries heavy implications. You must ask about family alliances, comment on trade yields, notice who is dancing with whom. Every raised goblet is an opportunity. Every jest might carry a barb. You toast and joke and observe, and all the while, you calculate. Because being a medieval king is not about gold crowns or thrones. It is about the unending presence of responsibility and power, on your shoulders, in your words, behind your gaze. And when the feast ends, and the courtiers drift away, and the candles burn low, and you finally retire to your chambers, the weight does not lift. You remove your robes, your rings, your crown, but not the burden. It lies beside you in the dark, and it will be the first thing to greet you when the sun returns. By the time the first pale rays of sunlight began to pierce the dense morning mist clinging to the castle's outer walls, The king was already awake, not because he wanted to be, but because he had to be. Unlike the storybook depictions of effortless authority and endless leisure, the real life of a medieval king was grueling, relentless, and deeply isolating. It was not a role of unchecked indulgence, but of constant calculation, heavy expectation, and the ever-present specter of internal dissent or foreign threat. The throne was not a seat of luxury. It was a burden worn like armor every waking moment. He rose early, sometimes before the sun, assisted by a regimented line of attendants. These were not just servants, but trusted members of his household, trained to handle the rituals of royal preparation with practiced precision. They clothed him in silence, first the linen undershirt, then the woolen hose and tunic, followed by a belt that bore his status and, on ceremonial days, a robe or mantle heavy with embroidery and fine thread, often gold. Every layer symbolized authority, wealth, and stability. The process wasn't just about getting dressed, it was performance, broadcast to those who watched. Because in the medieval world, the king's image was half his power. Privacy, even at dawn, was a concept he rarely enjoyed. A monarch was never truly alone. Eyes were always present, watching, judging, waiting. Even in the early hours when the rest of the world was barely stirring, the weight of the crown pressed down on his shoulders like a silent command. Breakfast came next, though calling it a meal might be generous. It was usually simple fare, coarse bread still warm from the hearth, a wedge of soft cheese, perhaps a sliver of salted fish or preserved meat, some fruit when available, and a mug of watered-down wine or ale. But the simplicity of the food belied the complexity of the moment. As he chewed, his advisors and courtiers began to trickle in. Petitioners waited at the door. Pages carried sealed scrolls. Even the first bites of bread were often interrupted by urgent questions. Should this tax be raised? Should this noble be punished or pardoned? Should a daughter be married off to solidify a wavering alliance? His word was law, but it also had to be timely, strategic, and if possible, pleasing to as many factions as possible. He had to walk a tightrope every single morning, balancing justice and pragmatism with political survival. The decisions didn't wait for digestion. They came sharp and fast like arrows, and each answer had the potential to cause a ripple, or a storm. Once fed and briefed, the king proceeded to the day's audiences. In the high-ceilinged great hall or a more intimate council chamber, he met with nobles, bishops, knights, foreign envoys, and emissaries. Some came seeking favor, others came bearing threats. A few delivered news, rarely good. These sessions demanded mental sharpness, political savvy, and a deep memory for alliances, betrayals, debts, and names. The language of court was not blunt. It was coded, laced with pleasantries that masked demands and compliments that warned of consequences. A slip of the tongue, a display of weakness, could be remembered for years and exploited for decades. And still, no matter how exhausted he felt, or how weighed down his conscience might be, the king had to perform the part. He couldn't slouch on the throne. He couldn't look pained or ill. Whispers of weakness could travel faster than his messengers, and once they took root, they were hard to uproot. So he sat tall, voice steady, gaze level. He projected strength, certainty, and command, even if inside he felt anything but. Beyond the chambers, life carried on. Blacksmiths rang iron on anvils. Servants scurried between quarters. Guards patrolled. Cooks prepared the midday meal. The castle itself was like a living thing, breathing and moving around its center, the king. And though he was surrounded by activity, by people and purpose, he was often alone in the truest sense, isolated by status, by responsibility, and by the sheer scale of what he was expected to bear. Being a medieval king was not about ease or excess. It was about endurance, about the quiet strain of rule. Every hour was a performance. Every gesture mattered. Every word had weight. The crown didn't just rest on his head. It pressed down on every part of him, from the moment he opened his eyes to the moment he finally closed them, if sleep came at all. And even in sleep, the kingdom still whispered, still waited. The medieval king's morning wasn't as regal or romantic as it might seem in stories. There were no golden sunbeams gently parting velvet drapes, no sweet choral harmonies ushering him into wakefulness. More often than not, it all began with discomfort. Castles, despite their grandeur, were stone fortresses, drafty, damp, and perpetually cold. And stone, as it turns out, clings to the chill of night with a stubborn persistence. Even buried beneath layers of thick woolen and fur-lined blankets, the air cut at your nose, your cheeks, your fingertips. There were no fireplaces in every room, no central heat, just a flickering torch on the wall and perhaps a smoldering hearth if you were lucky. And under the bed, a chamber pot, cold as the stone beneath it. The king didn't wake alone. The castle staff, already up and working long before dawn, moved through the corridors like quiet ghosts. Servants bustled in the periphery, stoking fires, hauling buckets of water, laying out garments. One might gently knock or whisper outside the royal chamber. If the king was feeling civil, he might respond with a groggy murmur or a stretch, giving permission to enter. If not, they would proceed with the caution of someone diffusing an explosive. Even royalty had moods, and waking a cold, cranky king was a gamble few relished. Rising from bed was its own ritual, less about comfort and more about spectacle. A king didn't shuffle into slippers and pour his own tea. No, he was dressed like a knight preparing for battle. The underclothes came first, linen or wool, soft if you were fortunate. Then came the hose, fastened tightly to stay in place, followed by a tunic, a belt, perhaps a surcoat embroidered with family symbols or regional colors. Dressing was not just about staying warm, it was a visual assertion of dominance. A thick velvet cloak suggested stability and wealth. Finely stitched cuffs or imported dyes whispered of connections, power, divine right. Each layer said something to anyone who dared to look. As for hygiene, forget our modern expectations. A daily shower? Not in the cards. Medieval kings didn't bathe daily. In fact, full-body baths were exceptional events, scheduled affairs requiring massive effort. Water to be heated by fire, a tub hauled in, servants to pour, scrub, dry. Instead, daily cleanliness was a patchwork effort. A splash of water to the hands and face, a linen cloth dabbed with rosewater, herbal pastes rubbed over teeth. And then, of course, perfume. Scented oils and fragrances didn't just enhance one's presence, they masked the unmistakable reality of life without plumbing. Then came the barber. His job wasn't limited to trimming the beard or cutting hair. He might also let blood, a ritual believed to balance the four humors in the body, a mix of pseudo-medicine and tradition. The barber was equal parts stylist, surgeon, and confidant. He knew secrets. He knew scars. His tools were sharp, his hands practiced, and his presence was a fixture in the king's preparation. By the time the king was clothed, cleaned, and styled, the real business of ruling began. And despite what art and legend suggest, it wasn't all velvet thrones and goblets of wine. It was a grind, an endless stream of documents to read, disputes to mediate, alliances to weigh, taxes to assess. Council meetings stretched for hours. Nobles brought grievances. Peasants begged for protection or justice. Foreign emissaries hinted at war or marriage. And through it all, the castle continued to thaw. The morning bread remained hard, and the staff kept their eyes low. Before the first bite of breakfast passed his lips, the burden of rule, symbolized by the crown resting on a stand nearby, had already begun to press down on his shoulders. It wasn't pageantry. It wasn't power for power's sake. It was work. Relentless, exhausting, thankless work. The kind that started before a man fully opened his eyes, and that didn't stop even when he closed them again. Being a medieval king meant responsibility without rest. It meant rising in the cold and shouldering a kingdom before the sun had properly risen. It meant navigating not just enemies on the battlefield, but traitors in court, demands from the church, and expectations from every corner of the realm. There was no snooze button on sovereignty, only duty, and the long, hard day ahead. By the time the king stirred from his heavy, linen-draped bed, the castle was already humming with quiet activity. The sun had barely begun its climb, casting a pale gold light through the high, narrow windows, illuminating the edges of thick stone walls. Outside, the world was cold and damp. Inside, it wasn't much better. Despite the fire kept smoldering in the hearth all night, the draft found its way through every crack and corner of the aging stone fortress. A servant had risen long before, tiptoeing across the creaky wooden floors to lay fresh logs in the fireplace, hoping to warm the room before the royal body began to stir. Waking up wasn't a peaceful ritual. It was scheduled, methodical, and public. A team of attendants, groom of the stool, pages, squires, filed in quietly, each with a role to play. One held warm water for washing. Another carried layers of heavy embroidered robes. Another would help the king relieve himself. Royal dignity, as it turned out, involved quite a few other people. The privacy that modern life affords didn't exist for a medieval monarch. Not when your body symbolized your kingdom. Not when your appearance was political. Then came dressing. It wasn't simply pulling on a tunic and belt. It was a daily construction. Every piece had purpose. Layers of wool, linen, fur, and ornamentation designed to project wealth, status, and divine right. While the king was helped into his garments, he might listen to the steward read the schedule for the day. Meetings with advisors, letters from distant nobles, disputes to settle, maybe a public audience or a ceremonial meal. Sometimes a visiting bishop would request a moment. Other times it would be a feudal lord bearing tribute, or complaint. Breakfast was light but ceremonial. Bread, cheese, dried fruit, watered wine. Eaten not alone, but in the company of chosen courtiers or advisors. Every meal was an opportunity for theater. The king didn't eat to simply satisfy hunger. He dined to be seen. His hands might be washed before and after by a young noble seeking favor. A food taster might take the first bite to ensure nothing had been poisoned. Every gesture, every action carried the weight of performance. Even chewing was political. Before the morning ended, matters of law and governance were already underway. The king's role wasn't simply to rule, it was to be present, visible, active. Decisions needed his signature, his voice, his authority. Delegation existed, yes, but even the act of delegating had to be done with care. A ruler who disappeared behind castle doors for too long risked whispers, rumors, rebellions brewed in silence. Being king wasn't about lounging on a throne. It was a daily parade of rituals, appearances, and expectations. Before noon, he had already been bathed, clothed, fed, and briefed. Never alone, never unobserved. And that was just the beginning. It's one thing to wear the crown. It's another thing entirely to carry everything it represents, to shoulder the hopes of the living and the debts of the dead, to be constantly compared not only to your father, but to saints, tyrants, and mythical conquerors whose names echo through time. By the time a medieval king planted himself on the throne, he wasn't simply assuming control of a kingdom. He was stepping into a living saga. That story had been forged through generations of war and marriage, betrayal and honor, pacts sealed in blood, and battles that became the bones of legends. And once a king took up that mantle, every decision he made became a line in that story. It wasn't just governance, it was inheritance. And that inheritance came shackled to ghosts. You didn't begin with a clean slate. If your father had foes, they didn't forgive just because the face had changed. If your grandfather made a grievous mistake, lost a war, broke an oath, betrayed an ally, it was your name that bore the consequences. The crown was not a symbol of forgiveness. It was a ledger of unpaid debts. Your court remembered every grudge, every broken promise, every betrayal. Nobles played the long game, plotting, scheming, nesting their plans inside generations. They whispered in corridors, watched for weakness, and waited, sometimes for years, for the fault lines of history to crack again under your reign. You weren't just ruling in the present, you were constantly battling the unfinished business of the past. Then there was blood, your own. Producing an heir wasn't optional. It wasn't just family business. It was national policy. A king's ability to reproduce was political capital. A childless throne was a magnet for chaos, a target for rival claimants, opportunists, and ambitious nobles. War didn't always need foreign threats. It often started with a contested birthright. If you had daughters, pressure to remarry intensified. If you had no children at all, suspicion festered. Religious leaders muttered about divine judgment. The nobility grew tense. Rebellion didn't need swords to start. It could begin with a whispered doubt at a feast or a prayer said too loudly. Legacy wasn't a luxury. It was a mirror that reflected your reign long after you were gone. Were you the builder of cathedrals? The restorer of peace? The patron of knowledge? Or were you the one who lost lands, drained coffers, and sowed unrest? Did you die praised in chronicles, preserved in prayer, etched in stained glass? Or were you written out of history by a successor who wanted your failures forgotten? The chroniclers didn't just record events, they shaped them. With ink, they carved reputations. And if they turned against you, no amount of victory could drown out their condemnation. For kings who managed to navigate the politics, win wars, and secure heirs, legacy became armor. It protected their bloodline and bolstered their legend. But for those who faltered, who trusted the wrong ally, mistreated the church, or lost too many battles, it became a curse passed down like a sickness. You weren't permitted to fade into obscurity. Every misstep echoed through corridors of power. Your name would be sung, sure, but not always in reverence. Some would use it as warning, others as mockery. To wear the crown in the medieval world was to become a monument with no guarantees. You stood not at the peak of power, but under its heaviest burden. You governed with the breath of ancestors on your neck and the eyes of the future on your hands. You didn't just write policy. You wrote your place in a myth that began before you and would stretch far beyond you. The throne could lift you into legend. It could trap you in legacy. Or it could burn you, slowly, relentlessly, until nothing was left but the name and the weight it left behind. By now, the midday sun would be hanging high over the castle walls, casting short, sharp shadows across the stone courtyards. The air would carry the scent of heated stone, distant livestock, and the faint whiff of roasting meat from the kitchen yards. Inside, the king had likely returned from his brief tour of morning duties to a more secluded, carefully chosen space, his private chamber, or perhaps one of the smaller audience rooms where pressing matters could be handled without the formality of court. These weren't simply respites for comfort. These rooms were chosen for their strategic quiet, offering the kind of privacy necessary for political nuance and sensitive discussions, away from too many ears or wandering eyes. The king's private council, his inner circle, was more than a mere group of advisors. It was a carefully curated network of influence. They weren't always the most powerful figures at court, but they were often the most capable, loyal, or useful. The chancellor might arrive with scrolls of correspondence from rival monarchs or noble houses, each sealed with wax and heavy with diplomatic subtext. The treasurer could present a wooden board etched with numbers and symbols, laying out the economic balance of the kingdom, the state of royal coffers, market instability, shortages of grain or salt, and the risks of funding a new warship fleet. And if the kingdom was on edge, the spy master, hooded, discreet, might unroll coded reports collected from dockside murmurs, monastery whispers, or intercepted messages from cloistered towers. Talk of uprisings, foreign spies, bribed border guards. This wasn't theater. This was quiet tension, thick as wet parchment. These weren't dramatic war room scenes. There were no slamming fists or clashing egos, just hushed voices, notes passed beneath candlelight, and the sound of wax seals being broken. Every decision mattered. To raise a new levy might provoke dissent. To shift tariffs could empower some merchants, while bankrupting others. A proposed marriage alliance could repair a fragile peace, or push an enemy to war. And so, the king didn't always act like a towering figure of command. More often, he resembled a chess player, moving pieces with calm calculation, second-guessing every move, seeking advantage not just for today, but years down the road. Ruling wasn't about dominance. It was about foresight and patience, and knowing exactly when to lie, flatter, or delay. Just beyond the threshold, pages waited silently, backs straight, hands folded. Guards flanked the entrances, shifting only when summoned. They weren't merely decoration. They were the infrastructure of authority, the ever-watchful sentinels to a power that could not afford distraction. If the king needed to send an urgent message, a scribe would be summoned. Ink-stained hands, a worn quill, parchment rolled and ready. The words mattered, but so did the seal, the unmistakable stamp of royal will. And if that message needed to travel far, to another kingdom, to a rebellious lord's castle, to a distant monastery harboring secrets, it would be handed to a trusted courier. These weren't casual messengers. They were trained to disappear into forests, bribe their way through checkpoints, or outpace pursuers across unfamiliar terrain. Their survival and success meant the difference between order and chaos. All of it, the murmured conversations, the slight tilts of the head, the ink drying on secret scrolls, was the real work of kingship. Not the spectacle of crowns and scepters, but the small, silent choreography of power. This was what actually moved kingdoms, not armies, not laws, but information, intent, and timing. And yet, with all the knowledge, planning, and diplomacy in the world, control was never absolute. The crown did not come with a guarantee. A single bad harvest could starve cities. A single baron's betrayal could unravel a border. A neighboring kingdom's sudden ambition could shift alliances like sand underfoot. The king ruled. Yes, but always in the shadow of uncertainty, knowing that his hold on the throne was as much about perception as it was about strength. This wasn't a fairy tale of glory or destiny. This was the slow, careful machinery of rule, a life of relentless vigilance, deliberate restraint, and constant negotiation. One decision, one document, one whisper at a time. Being a medieval king wasn't just about holding power, it was about embodying it. It meant living as a symbol, a representation of divine authority and national unity. And that symbolism was expressed through an endless, exhausting choreography of ritual. Ceremony wasn't decoration, it was infrastructure, a way to stabilize rule, display legitimacy, and reinforce hierarchy. Every gesture had to be deliberate, every movement laced with meaning. Even silence had weight. Even stillness spoke volumes. A king's day rarely started with rest or quiet planning. More often, it began with the ceremony of awakening. The morning dressing was not private, nor was it quick. It was a formal rite, sometimes attended by high-ranking courtiers and religious advisors. Layers of fabric and finery were draped with care. Linen, wool, rich velvet dyed with costly colors, embroidered silk imported from abroad. Jewelry and insignia were chosen not for style, but for message. Was he projecting humility today? Or dominance? Piety? Or magnificence? Dressing a king meant crafting a political statement from thread and gold. It could take more than an hour, sometimes two, before he was ready to appear. Once dressed, the day unfolded in segments of spectacle. On religious feast days, he led grand processions through the echoing halls of his castle, down cold corridors lined with tapestries and torchlight, flanked by bishops and barons in full regalia. On court days, he took his place on the throne, stiff-backed and stone-faced, while subjects and courtiers approached with grievances, tributes, and pleas. Every blink was watched, every pause scrutinized. He couldn't afford to show fatigue, irritation, or even too much interest. A misplaced frown might be interpreted as insult, a chuckle as condescension. The king's public image had to be curated with relentless care. Too cheerful, and he was seen as soft. Too stern, and whispers of cruelty spread. If he looked worn or sickly, rivals might start plotting, sensing weakness. To the outside world, the monarch wasn't a man with moods and needs. He was a living emblem of stability. The court was a pressure cooker of politics and performance, and the king stood at its center, always on stage, always under the lights. Religion imposed its own ceremonial burdens. A medieval king was not only a secular ruler, but also God's appointed sovereign. His schedule was peppered with masses, blessings, and prayers. He had to fast when required, walk barefoot through holy sites, and kneel before relics of saints with performative reverence. Priests and monks were often more influential than generals. A conversation with a bishop could have as much impact as a treaty signed with a foreign prince. The boundary between faith and governance was paper thin, and ignoring spiritual duty could be political suicide. Then came the constant calendar of events: seasonal festivals, ceremonial hunts, royal weddings, coronations, and state banquets. None of it was optional. Each demanded hours of presence, precision, and poise. The food, the seating, the music, even the lighting, each detail reflected back on the king. Even leisure became spectacle. A hunt might seem like recreation, but it was in truth a stage-managed display of masculinity, dominance, and martial skill. Missing a festival or misstepping during a ritualized hunt could stir gossip or provoke disdain. And should a king falter in any of these ceremonies, stumble during a coronation, botch the words of a sacred chant, or miss a saint's feast, there could be real consequences. Rumors might spread that God had withdrawn his favor. Omens would be read into the smallest errors. Political factions might use the slip as leverage. In a society obsessed with symbolism and signs, even the most innocent mistake could be seen as divine judgment. So while today's royals might smile for cameras and wave from balconies, the medieval king lived in unbroken performance. From waking to sleep, he was watched, weighed, and whispered about. There was no intermission, no off-stage. Every room was a stage, every gesture a message, and every moment a test. From the outside, being a medieval king might seem like the ultimate form of authority, total command over land, law, and life. But the reality was more precarious. Power wasn't something a king simply held. It was something he constantly negotiated, defended, and justified. And at the heart of that reality was a hard truth. No king ruled alone. A monarch was surrounded by layers of advisors, nobles, clergy, and administrators, each with their own agendas, alliances, and ambitions. Council meetings weren't relaxed discussions. They were battlegrounds of influence. A proposed law or tax might look straightforward on parchment, but pushing it through meant appeasing powerful barons, persuading bishops, and avoiding the wrath of foreign envoys. Every decision risked upsetting the fragile balance between competing factions. Even within his own court, a king walked a political tightrope. Nobles expected privileges in exchange for loyalty. Deny them too much, and whispers of rebellion grew. Grant them too much, and they became uncontrollable. Kings had to read their nobles like opponents in a chess game. Each move calculated, each favor a potential liability. Betrayals were not uncommon. A cousin, a childhood friend, even a brother might plot against him if the throne seemed within reach. Religion, too, could challenge royal authority. A king who defied the church risked more than bad press. He risked excommunication, spiritual condemnation, and widespread unrest. The Pope's word could overrule a monarch's decree. Local bishops could rally opposition from the pulpit. The church held immense influence over the hearts and minds of the people, and a king who clashed with clerical power often found himself dangerously isolated. And then there was the challenge of distance. Medieval kingdoms stretched across rough terrain, with poor roads and slow communication. A revolt in the north might take weeks to even reach the king's ears, let alone be addressed. Local lords effectively ruled in the king's name, but often did so with their own rules. Royal authority was only as strong as the king's ability to enforce it, and that required money, men, and reliable messengers, none of which were guaranteed. Coinage and taxation were another constant headache. A king needed funds for war, infrastructure, gifts, and diplomacy. But taxes were deeply unpopular. Raising them too high could provoke revolts. Lowering them meant cutting into royal ambition. Minting coins had to be done carefully, and debasement, reducing the precious metal content, could lead to inflation, panic, or worse, accusations of corruption. A medieval economy was fragile, and missteps echoed loudly. Laws had to be enforced, but justice wasn't a straightforward process. Many local lords had their own courts. Custom varied from region to region. What was legal in one shire might be condemned in another. A king could issue edicts, but enforcing them meant a chain of trust, cooperation, and sometimes brute force. Royal judges were sent out to administer uniform law, but their loyalty wasn't always certain. And peasants? Most saw the king only as a name on a coin or a distant figure in prayers. Their daily lives were shaped more by local landlords than royal policies. Even the army wasn't always under direct royal control. Most military might came from the feudal system. A king summoned his vassals, who were obligated to provide troops, but only for a set number of days. Campaigns had to be timed carefully. A war dragging into autumn risked desertion, starvation, or open mutiny. Knights might fight for glory, but they also wanted compensation. If the king failed to provide spoils or pensions, they wouldn't return. So yes, a medieval king wore the crown. He sat the throne. He spoke with divine sanction. But behind the regal image was a man surrounded by volatility. Power was real, but it was brittle. One wrong alliance, one failed harvest, one insult to the wrong noble, and everything could spiral. The illusion of control was just that, an illusion. The crown was heavy, not just with gold, but with doubt. To rule was to gamble, with trust, with lives, with fate. And every day the stakes were raised anew. If you imagine a medieval king casually strolling through his gardens, free to come and go as he pleases, you'd be mistaken. The reality was far less romantic and much more claustrophobic. Kings didn't just rule. They were ruled by the intricate machinery of court life. They lived in what could only be described as a gilded cage, where the trappings of power doubled as the boundaries of confinement. Their daily existence was so meticulously planned and supervised that even their breaths felt orchestrated by others. Movements were carefully orchestrated. A king did not simply decide to go for a walk. His path, companions, and even how long he could linger somewhere were often predetermined. His life was measured in audiences, ceremonies, rituals, and councils. Spontaneity was not only frowned upon, it was dangerous. Every outing meant security, symbolism, and a message. And if the weather didn't permit or his health faltered, there would be a protocol for that too, filed and known to dozens of people. Even within the stone walls of his own castle or palace, a king rarely had true solitude. Private chambers were not truly private. They were populated by a rotating cast of courtiers, attendants, bodyguards, and scribes. Privacy was not a right, but a negotiated privilege, and rarely granted in full. Night and day he was surrounded. Some slept in antechambers or nearby rooms, ever present to assist, observe, or manipulate. Conversations were overheard. Murmured thoughts could become court gossip by morning. Etiquette governed not only speech, but posture, proximity, and timing. Only certain people were allowed to look directly at the king, and fewer still could address him unprompted. Even silence was strategic. A king might sit unmoving on a ceremonial throne for hours, not because he wished to, but because stillness projected majesty. Every gesture, whether lifting a goblet or nodding to a noble, was weighted with significance. To be absent was to raise suspicion. To act informally was to invite criticism. Despite all this carefully maintained aura of control, kings remained frighteningly vulnerable. The threat of assassination or poisoning never truly left their minds. To combat this, most kings had trusted servants taste every dish before it reached their lips. Kitchens were guarded. Ingredients were scrutinized. And yet, fear lingered in every bite. Meals, though often elaborate, were shrouded in caution. Even something as seemingly mundane as bathing carried complexity. Kings bathed infrequently, and when they did, it was a production. Superstition and limited scientific understanding shaped hygiene practices. Too much bathing was thought to invite illness. When a king did take a bath, usually a warm soak with herbs and oils, it was attended by physicians and watched by guards. The bath might be lined with silk or perfumed water, but beneath the luxury was paranoia. Every act of cleansing was also an act of surveillance. Rulership did not happen in isolation. Royal decrees were rarely the king's alone. Behind every sealed scroll was a chamber full of advisors, ministers, scribes, and sometimes spies. Laws were debated and edited long before they ever reached a king's hands. The seal was his, but the thoughts belonged to many. The burden was knowing which advisors to heed. Some offered wisdom. Others offered flattery laced with ambition. Misplacing trust could destroy a reign, or worse, a dynasty. When illness struck, a king's body stopped being his own. Physicians, monks, and astrologers all weighed in. Their treatments were a blend of ritual, guesswork, and sometimes genuine danger. Bloodletting, potions laced with mercury or arsenic, prayers whispered in Latin, these weren't options. They were procedures. His health became a matter of state, debated and managed in public whispers. And when death approached, it was never allowed to come quietly. A dying king had a final script, too, a carefully rehearsed passage to the afterlife meant to reassure subjects, nobles, and rivals alike. His final words were recorded. His posture, prayers, and even final breath were curated for symbolism and legacy. To die as a king was one last performance, one more act on the stage of monarchy. In the end, being a medieval king was not a life of unchecked power or personal indulgence. It was a continuous burden of appearances, expectations, and relentless scrutiny. Every moment was a test of endurance. Every action had implications. Beneath the golden crown, behind the velvet robes, was a man who lived not in freedom, but in the unyielding grip of obligation and the ever-watchful eyes of his court and country. It's tempting to picture a medieval king as the embodiment of constant luxury, draped in velvet, dining from silver platters, attended by servants at all hours, and holding court beneath golden canopies. But by the time you reach the 12th part of this tale, that shimmering image starts to wear thin. The reality was far less glamorous and far more demanding. Being a king in the Middle Ages wasn't about basking in glory. It was about managing endless responsibilities, navigating treacherous politics, and coping with the grinding repetition of daily duty. Each day began painfully early. Before the sun even touched the towers of the castle, a servant would slip into the royal chamber to stoke the hearth, ensuring the chill didn't creep too far into the stone walls. Shutters were opened just enough to let in the first slivers of gray light. The king wouldn't simply rise and dress himself. That would be beneath his station, and logistically impractical, given the layers of attire expected. Pages, squires, and attendants would quietly line up to help prepare him. Every piece of clothing was significant. Thick wool in winter, light linen in summer, a plain tunic if the day called for simplicity, or a richly embroidered surcoat if he was meeting with foreign dignitaries. Every thread carried symbolic meaning, from the color to the trim. Getting dressed could take half an hour or more. After dressing came worship. Mass was not optional. It was part ritual, part performance, and entirely political. Skipping it wasn't just frowned upon. It was dangerous. The people believed kings were divinely appointed, so every gesture of piety reinforced legitimacy. A missed service could lead to whispers, and whispers could become unrest. The king's soul, his crown, and his public image were all tied up in the rhythm of religious observance. From there, the real work began. Hours were spent locked in council chambers, surrounded by advisors, clerks, and emissaries. With no quick communication, everything was done in person or on parchment. Letters, scrolls, reports, each sealed with wax and carried by hand. Every issue demanded attention. Taxes that weren't being collected, villages in dispute, lords refusing orders, rumors of rebellion, shifts in alliances, trade route complications, border skirmishes, and every voice in the room had its own angle, its own agenda. The king had to weigh their counsel, parse truth from flattery, and make decisions that would ripple across the kingdom. Meals offered only the illusion of a break. Often they were opportunities for diplomacy. Banquets could serve as peace talks in disguise. A visiting noble might compliment the wine, only to follow up with a veiled demand. A foreign ambassador might smile through supper while plotting concessions behind closed doors. Even in moments of laughter, politics simmered just beneath the surface. Then came the matters of justice, grim decisions that no one wanted but only the king could make. Who deserved to be rewarded? Who needed to be punished? Pardons, executions, imprisonments, each judgment shaped the law and the legacy of the realm. Mercy had consequences. So did cruelty. Every signature bore the weight of human lives. Evenings were quieter, but rarely restful. More documents to review, more messages to send, more concerns to consider about enemies abroad, unrest at home, or factions forming within the court. If the kingdom was at war, sleep came even harder. The flicker of candlelight often accompanied a troubled mind. Behind castle walls, in chambers lined with tapestries, the burden of the crown never truly lifted. So what was life like as a medieval king? Not an endless feast or a fairy tale. It was long hours filled with complex choices, constant vigilance, and an unshakable awareness that one misstep could bring ruin. The crown wasn't just a symbol of power. It was a symbol of responsibility, and it never came off. Not really. The throne? It wasn't always a seat of comfort or glory. More often, it was simply the heaviest chair in the coldest room of the castle. It's early morning in a drafty, echoing stone fortress somewhere in medieval Europe. The air is damp, and the only light comes from a narrow slit in the stone wall where the sun has just begun to rise. While the rest of the castle might still lie in shadows, the king has already been awake for some time. Not because he wants to be, but because being a medieval monarch doesn't come with luxuries like sleeping in. It can't. The throne might look regal, but it carries the weight of an entire realm. Contrary to the romantic visions of storybooks, being a medieval king meant constant labor, never-ending vigilance, and the relentless responsibility of serving as the living hub of military, economic, religious, and domestic affairs. He wakes in a room that, by modern standards, is more austere than opulent. The floor is stone, covered with rough wool rugs. The walls are hung with heavy tapestries, not just for decoration, but to insulate against the morning chill that seeps in through every crack. The bed is high, hard, and narrow. There are no plush pillows or fluffy blankets, only thick wool and fur. A couple of servants stand silently in the background, prepared with a basin of warm water for the king to wash, though warm is generous. Bathing isn't part of a daily ritual, even for royalty. It's reserved for special occasions or illness. Cleanliness exists, but it follows a different logic than today. Too much water on the skin, physicians warn, might open the pores to disease. Instead, the king freshens up with a quick rinse to his face, hands, and mouth. He changes into a clean linen undershirt, often with help. A valet or chamberlain assists him with dressing. Depending on the day's agenda, he might wear a heavy wool tunic, layered with a long robe or mantle, and thick hose tied with garters. If travel or warfare looms, armor may be laid out later. But for now, it's the ceremonial dress of a ruler who must be seen and listened to. Breakfast is sparse but efficient. A few slices of bread, a wedge of aged cheese, perhaps a mug of watered wine or ale. On occasion, there might be a piece of fruit or a scrap of preserved meat. It's not a leisurely affair. Often, he eats with a trusted circle of advisors, men who bring news from across the kingdom. Even in these early moments, decisions begin. Rumors of unrest in a border town, a request from a noble family for intervention in a land dispute. There is no peace, only pacing. Then comes the bulk of the work, the administrative and judicial grind that occupies most of a king's waking hours. Royal business is rarely glorious. Much of it involves listening to petitions and grievances. Reports are read aloud by scribes. A village is flooded and demands help. A baron accuses a neighbor of encroaching on ancestral lands. The king hears them all. Justice moves slowly in the medieval world, and the king is often the final court of appeal. His word is law, and with every judgment he risks the loyalty of one side or another. Following that comes diplomacy, receiving messengers from distant courts, examining scrolls covered in Latin, consulting advisors on how to reply to veiled threats or marriage proposals. Political marriages are one of the primary tools of peacemaking. A handshake with the wrong noble could undo years of careful planning. The king must read between the lines of every letter, gauge the subtle tones of each envoy's speech, and reply with equal finesse. Every nod, every pause, every inflection becomes political currency, and always looming is the church. A king's rule depends not only on secular might, but on divine approval, or at least the appearance of it. Bishops and abbots wield influence, and the pope's favor can make or break a monarch. If a cleric accuses the court of moral failing or corruption, it must be addressed. If the local bishop seeks funding for a new abbey, the king must weigh the benefit against his strained treasury. Even the perception of religious error could be disastrous. To offend the church was to risk not only rebellion, but eternal damnation. By midday, the king is exhausted but must press on. He might inspect troops or review plans for a new fortification. He might receive tribute from loyal subjects or gifts from hopeful visitors. In between, he might meet with scribes to dictate letters or with his steward to review the kingdom's ledgers. Peasants occasionally find their way into his presence too, bringing personal pleas for justice or mercy, especially if the king wishes to be seen as a benevolent ruler. All this occurs under the watchful gaze of courtiers and officials, all of whom interpret his behavior. A frown might spark fear. A laugh might send rumors swirling. The king must be ever composed. His garments are thick, layered, often uncomfortable, but he wears them with purpose. To be a medieval king is to perform as much as to govern. Being a king in the medieval world means being more than a ruler. He is an administrator, a diplomat, a judge, a landlord, a military leader, and a religious symbol. There are no vacations. There is no private time. Even in his quietest moments, he carries the weight of a crown that never truly comes off. The regalia may sparkle in candlelight, but behind it lies the unending labor of survival, control, and sacrifice. The crown is not merely a privilege, it is a burden etched into every hour of the king's day. Evening in a medieval castle did not mark the end of a king's responsibilities, it marked their transformation. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the last natural light bled from the narrow slits in the castle walls, torches were lit one by one. Their amber glow stretched shadows into strange shapes that danced across the damp, age-worn stones. The once bustling great hall shifted in mood. Where advisors, nobles, and petitioners had gathered hours earlier, now only a low murmur remained. The clinking of wooden goblets being cleared, the scrape of trenchers being stacked, and the rustling movements of pages delivering documents still damp with ink. Night, for a medieval king, wasn't rest. It was a change in atmosphere. The nature of duty darkened, deepened. The burdens became more secretive, less visible, more personal. Daylight brought public rule, decrees, law-making, grand performances of justice. Night ushered in a different form of governance, private, tense, and shrouded in flickering candlelight. Where daylight meetings occurred in the open chambers, these nocturnal gatherings happened in tight, fortified spaces. The doors were thicker, the voices lower. In the solitude of night, the king might summon his spy master, whispered intelligence from borderlands, messages about potential rebellions, coded warnings of a noble family growing too bold or too rich. Every rumor weighed against reality, every silence scrutinized for meaning. A single misstep could turn a simmering grudge into open defiance. Trust was rare, and paranoia often better served survival than hope. If not with spies, he might sit with his chamberlain or treasurer. They would pore over ledgers, measuring the kingdom's lifeblood in coin and trade, tribute from distant lords, tariffs collected from merchant caravans, gold and silver tracked to the ounce. Coin was more than currency. It was leverage. A poorly performing province raised questions. A delay in taxes raised suspicions. Wealth was power, but only if it could be seen, counted, and wielded. Then there were the family discussions, quieter still but no less loaded. Plans for a marriage alliance, a daughter sent to solidify peace with a rival duchy, a son's disobedience and how it might reflect on the crown, the grooming of an heir, carefully calibrated to display strength while remaining loyal. Every royal child was a political instrument, every gesture toward affection laced with calculation. A family dinner might hide the early sketch of a treaty. A bedtime story might be a lesson in ruling. Sometimes, when all others were dismissed, the king would meet with a man of the cloth, not to legislate, but to confess, to unburden. A bishop, a monk, a personal confessor. The church held a mirror to the king's soul, reflecting guilt and offering forgiveness in equal measure. Scripture was read aloud. Penitence was suggested. Power did not absolve sin. It amplified its consequences. Even a king feared divine judgment. Even a king whispered prayers in the dark. And when the final audience ended, the king did not simply collapse into rest. His chamber was opulent. Fur-lined bedding, carved oak furniture, and woven tapestries thick enough to mute sound. But comfort did not guarantee sleep. The room might again become a war chamber, where maps were unrolled and decisions made in the dead of night, messages composed, envoys chosen, advisors summoned to refine or revise a course of action. Sleep remained elusive, a fleeting visitor, and when it did come, it rarely stayed long. The king's mind, trained for vigilance, never shut down completely. Dreams were not peaceful. They were cluttered with the ghosts of past choices, the what-ifs of policy, the screams of old battles, and the weight of future threats. A knock at the door might signal a midnight assassination, or merely urgent dispatches, but the dread was the same. Every noise was a potential alarm, every shadow a possible traitor. Because in those hours between dusk and dawn, stripped of his audience and pomp, a king stood exposed. His wealth and armies could not protect him from inner doubt, from the chill of regret, or from the toll of carrying an entire realm on a mind that never truly slept. By the time evening fell in a medieval castle, the atmosphere began to shift. The harsh daylight faded from the stone walls, replaced by the flickering glow of torchlight and the smoky haze from open hearths. A king's evening didn't begin with relaxation, it began with ritual. Sunset marked the start of another phase of duty, ceremony, and calculation. Peace, if it came at all, arrived late and came in fragments. A royal evening might begin with a small council, not the grand assemblies of daytime, but a quieter gathering, trusted advisors, perhaps a confessor, and maybe a favored knight or two. They would discuss matters too sensitive for the public eye. Negotiations, debts, suspicions of betrayal, or the behavior of troublesome nobles. These night meetings were often more honest than the grand displays earlier in the day. Voices were lower, eyes sharper. The king listened, asked questions, made notes. Sometimes he paced. Sometimes he stared into the fire, his thoughts masked behind stillness. The crown didn't rest just because the sun had. Once council business ended, the king's evening meal would follow. It wasn't always lavish. Depending on the kingdom's fortunes, it might be simple fare. Roasted game, a trencher of bread, boiled vegetables, perhaps wine. Thick, sour, and strong. On better nights, the feast was larger, but even then, kings rarely gorged themselves. Meals could be eaten in near silence or interrupted by a messenger's breathless entrance. A letter from a distant ally, news from the border, word of a merchant's caravan delayed. No moment was ever entirely free. After the meal, there might be entertainment, music, stories, or chess, but this wasn't guaranteed. If the king was ill, tired, or moody, the room remained still. Harps and lutes stayed quiet. Jesters waited in the wings. On good nights, laughter echoed in the hall. On bad nights, it didn't. The royal bedchamber wasn't necessarily a haven either. A king might share it with a queen, a favored consort, or no one at all. The room itself was large, but not always comfortable. Heavy tapestries muffled the chill. Rushes or straw scattered across the floor gave off a musty scent. The bed was high, often requiring a step stool, draped in thick linens and furs. Even sleep had its rules. A servant would warm the sheets. Another would stoke the fire. Candles were extinguished in order, one by one. Every movement was watched, timed, rehearsed. And even in bed, the king's mind worked. Plots didn't sleep. Enemies didn't pause. Even dreams could feel like battlefields. Echoes of the day's burdens wearing different masks. Sleep came late. Sometimes it didn't come at all. A restless king might summon a servant to read to him, or to sit silently nearby. The presence of another human being helped anchor him to the moment, a small comfort against the weight of endless decisions. For a medieval king, nightfall didn't offer freedom. It offered another kind of responsibility, the quiet kind, the heavy kind. A crown, after all, isn't just worn in public. It presses against your thoughts, even in darkness. And in the deep silence of the castle, with only the sound of wind against stone and the distant creak of wood beams shifting, the burdens of power were often loudest of all. Beneath the crown and the titles, medieval kings wore their power quite literally on their sleeves. Clothes were not simply garments. They were symbols, woven messages about wealth, influence, and the divine right to rule. The act of getting dressed was a statement, and the materials, colors, and cuts of royal clothing were carefully chosen, not just for fashion, but to reinforce authority and command respect. A king's day might begin with the donning of a simple linen chemise, soft and finely woven. It wasn't meant to be seen, but it mattered. Even the most private layers were custom made by personal tailors who knew the king's exact measurements, and sometimes even his preferences for embroidery that no one else would ever see. Over that, perhaps a tunic of fine wool or imported silk. The weight of a royal robe wasn't just physical, it was metaphorical. The thicker and more adorned it was, the more presence it gave the wearer. It reminded everyone in the room who held the power. Colors carried messages. Purple, especially Tyrian purple, was rare and shockingly expensive. It was made from the glands of sea snails and required tens of thousands of them to dye a single garment. Blue, too, had its own prestige, especially when derived from imported indigo. Gold thread, fur trim, jeweled clasps. Each detail served to magnify the king's status. Sumptuary laws often forbade commoners from wearing certain colors or fabrics to prevent them from looking too regal. Even dressing was ceremonial. It wasn't just about putting on clothes. It was an event witnessed by trusted attendants or family. The royal wardrobe was vast, stored in wooden chests, guarded by wardrobe keepers, and often transported in caravans when the king traveled. A single outfit might involve layers of padding, belts, swords, capes, and armor, each with its own purpose, function, and symbolism. Changing clothes was a lengthy ritual, often performed multiple times a day depending on events, councils, feasts, or hunts. Clothing also played a role in diplomacy. A king might gift rare fabrics or finely tailored outfits to allies and rivals alike. These weren't just presents. They were political gestures, quiet assertions of wealth, and soft challenges to another court's sophistication. A gifted robe could carry as much weight as a signed treaty. At court, the king was always being watched by nobles, ambassadors, servants, even enemies. Every stitch of what he wore said something. Even his shoes, often made of the finest leather and stitched with golden thread, were not spared the spotlight. A misstep in fashion could be interpreted as weakness or arrogance. In the end, a medieval king's wardrobe was more than vanity. It was an extension of his rule. Before he spoke a word, before a crown touched his head, his clothes were already doing the talking. And in a world where appearance could command loyalty or incite rebellion, what he wore might matter just as much as what he decreed. So when we imagine kings sitting on thrones or walking through castle halls, remember this: every fold of fabric was intentional. Every clasp was calculated, and every thread helped stitch the image of power that the world was expected to obey. When you think of a medieval king's meals, you probably picture giant banquet halls lined with golden goblets, whole roasted animals, and enough wine to fill a moat. And yes, those feasts did happen, but only on special occasions. Daily meals were another story altogether. Most of the time, a king's diet was dictated as much by the calendar as by personal preference. The medieval year was heavily shaped by the Christian church, and that meant many fasting days, often up to half the year. On those days, no meat, dairy, or eggs were allowed, which meant kings, like everyone else, had to settle for fish, legumes, and vegetables. But even when they could eat freely, meals weren't necessarily what we'd call balanced. Bread was a staple, dense, dark, and filling. White bread made from finely sifted flour was reserved for the elite. Kings often had a personal baker who ensured every loaf came out just right. Butter and cheese were common in some regions, while others preferred olive oil and herbs. Stews and pottages were served in abundance, often thickened with grains and flavored with seasonal produce. Meat was a sign of status. Beef, venison, boar, lamb, and game birds like swans or peacocks graced the royal table. The more exotic, the better. But keep in mind, these weren't always cooked to perfection. Recipes were hit or miss, and food safety standards were virtually non-existent. Spices imported from the East, Pepper, saffron, cloves, cinnamon were used not just for flavor, but to show off wealth. They were staggeringly expensive and sometimes covered the taste of less than fresh meat. Sweet dishes included spiced fruits, honey cakes, and occasionally a type of rice pudding made with almond milk. Sugar was available, but very rare. It was a luxury even kings didn't enjoy every day. Instead, honey was the go-to sweetener, and cooks used it generously. Meals were often accompanied by copious amounts of ale or wine, depending on the region and availability. Water, ironically, was usually avoided. It was often unsafe to drink. Wine could be watered down or spiced into mulled mixtures, while ale was brewed at low strength and consumed throughout the day, even at breakfast. Eating was also a performance. The king rarely dined alone. Meals were opportunities to display power, hierarchy, and ritual. A whole staff existed just to manage the dining experience: servers, tasters, carvers, cupbearers. There were rules about who could sit where, what they could eat, and how they behaved at the table. Manners mattered. Dishes were announced aloud. Hands were washed in perfumed basins before and after the meal. Music might play in the background, and entertainers would sometimes perform to keep the mood light, or at least tolerable. Yet, despite the grandeur, food poisoning wasn't uncommon, and digestion was taken seriously. Doctors might advise kings to take a walk after meals or recommend specific herbs to balance the humors. Meals could be lavish, yes, but they could also be a gamble. So, while the medieval king's table had more variety and indulgence than the average peasant's, it wasn't all roasted boar and endless feasts. Sometimes it was fish stew on a Friday, stale bread, and a hopeful prayer that the wine hadn't turned sour. And in the quiet of the night, long after the final course had been cleared and the candles extinguished, even kings went to bed with the occasional stomachache, just like everyone else. By the time you reached the 18th hour of your day as a medieval king, figuratively speaking, it wasn't really the evening feast or ceremony that defined you. It was the quiet spaces in between, the moments between meetings, between whispers, between heavy velvet curtains that muffled the world outside. You were at the top of the pyramid, yes, but that pyramid rested on trembling legs, fragile alliances, uncertain loyalties, and an endless web of expectation. You'd probably already sat through a long council session by now, where the talk swirled like smoke: land disputes, grain shortages, rebellious barons, unpaid taxes. The lords and advisors spoke in circles, each with their own motive folded inside their words. You listened, or tried. It wasn't boredom that wore you down. It was the sheer repetition. The same issues cycled through with different names and slightly different stakes, but the rhythm of it stayed the same, and sometimes it felt like you were less a ruler and more a placeholder, a face for the institution, a signature on a scroll. And then there was the constant presence of the church. By the 18th part of your day, a bishop or abbot had likely visited you, offering not just spiritual guidance, but political insight cloaked in scripture. Their words were really just about heaven. Every blessing carried a price. Every prayer had an angle. The church was powerful, often more so than the throne itself. As king, you relied on it for legitimacy, for public support, for divine justification. But it also meant walking a narrow path, step too far from their teachings, and the consequences weren't just spiritual. Excommunication wasn't just about your soul. It was a political death sentence. Somewhere in the quieter corridors of your keep, your chamberlain might have brought in a message, sealed with wax, marked by a crest. It could be anything: a noble asking for pardon, a request for troops, a secret report of unrest. Reading them became routine, like peeling the skin off an onion layer by layer. Every letter a new obligation, every wax seal another weight. And if the weather turned cold, if the wind screamed outside and rattled the shutters, it only amplified the isolation. Stone walls were thick, but they couldn't block out your own thoughts. You might sit by the fire, wine in hand, and watch the flame dance while your steward read aloud reports in a droning voice. You nodded, answered, gave orders, but your mind wandered. Did you trust your heir? Were your knights truly loyal? What alliances had started to fray without your notice? Evenings weren't rest. They were quieter performances. A private meeting with your spy master, a tense dinner with a visiting duke, a walk through your gardens with a favored advisor, where the conversation held more meaning than most would guess. You didn't rule from the throne alone. You ruled from these moments, these slivers of interaction where real influence passed hands. So by the 18th part of the day, you weren't just tired. You were saturated, not with labor, but with pressure. You were a symbol expected to be both untouchable and deeply human, powerful but relatable, firm but not cruel. And somehow, after all that, you still had to show up tomorrow, crown straight, words measured, ready to start the cycle all over again. Because being a medieval king wasn't about glory, it was about endurance. And the hardest part wasn't ruling others. It was keeping yourself from crumbling beneath the weight of the crown. At the heart of every medieval kingdom was the royal court, a space where power pulsed not through swords, but through whispers, glances, and careful games of deference. To the outside world, the court appeared elegant, refined, and ordered, a place of ceremony, tradition, and majestic authority. But from within, it was far more intricate, an ongoing theater of loyalty and betrayal, of strategic silence and opportunistic speech. And as king, you stood at the center of it all, a living symbol and a vulnerable man surrounded by masks. Your courtiers were not just nobles seeking to serve. They were competitors wrapped in silk, rivals disguised as advisors, each one skilled in the delicate craft of gaining favor. To remain in a king's good graces was to be safe, wealthy, perhaps even powerful. But to fall out of favor? That was dangerous. It could mean exile, imprisonment, or worse. And so, day by day, the court became a performance. Everyone watching, everyone watched. There was a rhythm to life in court. Mornings might begin with the king's formal rising, a choreographed ritual observed by only the most trusted. The chamberlain would oversee your dressing, servants would tend to your robes, and a select few might be granted the honor of a brief audience while you washed your hands or broke your fast. These seemingly mundane moments were, in fact, deeply political. To be near the king's person was to signal influence. Then came meetings, audiences, and councils. The great hall filled with footsteps as knights, bishops, nobles, and foreign envoys arrived to state their business. Each word spoken before the throne could alter someone's future. A grant of land, a denial of justice, a promise of support. Every decision rippled outward. The men who stood before you were not always honest, nor were they always your allies. Yet they smiled, bowed, and spoke carefully crafted words. And while decisions were made, much remained unsaid. That was the nature of court. What was not spoken often mattered more than what was. Glances exchanged across a room, a delay in response, a misplaced word that signaled uncertainty. In such an environment, even silence could be interpreted as judgment. Entertainment was constant, but never without motive. Feasts, tournaments, dances, and hunts served dual purposes. They reinforced royal authority and provided opportunity for bonding, yes, but also for scheming. A poorly timed jest could cause offense. A toast made too soon might betray eagerness. In a world where status was everything, even the arrangement of who sat beside whom could make or break alliances. And through it all, the king observed, or tried to. The hardest truth of court life was that no one, not even a monarch, could know every intention, every grudge, every whispered plan. The court was a living thing, shifting, watching, breathing in ambition and breathing out consequences. To rule was to listen constantly and speak sparingly, to act without revealing everything, to reward, to punish, and sometimes to do nothing at all, because waiting was itself a strategy. And in this strange world of veiled threats and polite smiles, the court was your greatest tool, or your most dangerous trap. Evening in the castle wasn't the end of a medieval king's day. It was often just the beginning of a slower, more intricate routine. The castle, draped in torchlight and echoing with soft footfalls, transformed into a quieter, more calculated space. By nightfall, much of the kingdom outside the walls was already asleep, but the king's duties often continued. Couriers still arrived, cloaked against the wind, delivering messages from distant regions. Advisors returned for final briefings. The night brought a different kind of business, more private, more political, and often more exhausting. The royal chamber wasn't simply a place to rest. It doubled as a private council room. Not every decision was made in the grand hall. Some of the most impactful conversations happened here, behind closed doors, with only the most trusted confidants present. A bishop discussing unrest among the clergy, a commander reporting rumors of rebellion, a steward reviewing the financial strain of war. The king listened, often seated by the hearth, wine in hand but mind alert. Sleep was a luxury. Worry was routine. There were letters to sign, some for diplomacy, others for punishment. Occasionally, a death warrant was approved in these dim hours. It was easier, perhaps, when faces were absent and the decisions abstract. Other nights were gentler. A musician might be summoned to play soft melodies on a lute. The queen, if relations were strong, might sit nearby, both of them cloaked in robes and shared silence. Conversation came in quiet bursts, reflections on their children, the state of the crops, the shifting winds of power in neighboring courts. But peace was never guaranteed. The chamber, guarded and sealed, was still vulnerable. Assassination attempts, while rare, were not unheard of. Some kings slept in armor. Others placed loyal guards just beyond the bedchamber doors, rotating every few hours. Candles were never fully extinguished. A single flame remained to cast moving shadows on the stone, as if even the walls couldn't fully sleep. When sleep did come, it came cautiously. The bed was large but firm, stuffed with straw and feathers, draped in heavy woolen blankets. It wasn't indulgent by modern standards. A restless king would toss and turn, mind racing with the burdens of power. Did he tax the people too heavily this season? Would the trade agreement hold? Was his heir ready or ambitious enough to betray him? The questions didn't stop when the sun went down, and somewhere below, in the still halls of the castle, a dog barked. A servant coughed. A torch sputtered. Life continued quietly as the king tried, often unsuccessfully, to rest. For even at night the crown pressed heavy, and the weight of the kingdom never truly lifted. In the twilight of his reign, a medieval king found his world shrinking. The court no longer bustled with the same frenetic energy. The voices grew quieter, the halls colder. Many of the knights who had once stood proudly by his side had fallen in battle or drifted away to estates of their own. The days of campaign and conquest were mostly behind him, replaced by days of ceremony, diplomacy, and chronic discomforts of age. But the crown was heavier than ever. Each morning began with ritual. Gone were the brutal hunts and sword practice of his youth. Now, attendants roused him gently from bed, helped him dress in layers of fine but cumbersome robes, and ushered him through a routine of whispered prayers and sluggish movement. His joints cracked, his breath came slow, but his presence was still demanded, for meetings, for audiences, for tradition. As king, even in old age, he had no privacy. Everything was watched, everything was managed. Meals were eaten in partial silence, with courtiers watching for the flick of a hand, the nod of approval. And though the dishes were finer than most in the realm could imagine, roasted birds, candied fruits, spiced wines, he often had little appetite. The pleasures of food paled in comparison to the pressure of presence. Each bite was measured, each pause scrutinized. Letters piled daily. Royal scribes read them aloud. Complaints from barons, appeals from the church, threats from neighboring lands. Every line required a response, and every response had consequences. The older he grew, the more careful he became. A single phrase in the wrong place could ignite rebellion or offend a powerful ally. He had seen it happen. His nights were no easier. The long, dark hours stretched wide, filled with creaking stone and memories. Dreams of youth and battle, of friends long gone, and enemies long buried. Sometimes he would sit at a narrow window, staring out into the moonlight over the towers and roofs of his kingdom. Below, the world went on without him. Lanterns flickered in distant homes. Dogs barked in the alleys. Life continued, indifferent. And yet, the burden remained. Even old and weathered, he was king. That title did not retire with age. Decisions still rested on his word. Justice still bore his name. And the peace of 1,000 souls still relied on his ability to endure another day. The throne, carved of cold oak and gilded trim, waited for him each morning. It always did. For a medieval king, nightfall did not bring peace. It brought another set of duties, rituals, and challenges that unfolded beneath the dim flicker of torches and candlelight. The public eye faded, the throne room emptied, but the responsibilities did not stop when the sun dipped below the horizon. Instead, they shifted into a quieter, more shadowed realm, one where diplomacy, family matters, and personal fears often crept closer than any battlefield ever did. In the evening, after the last audiences had been dismissed and the courtiers had retreated to their quarters, the king would often meet with his closest advisors, sometimes over wine, sometimes in tight-lipped whispers. Sensitive topics, the kind not suited for the full court, were saved for these hours. Plots unearthed, letters intercepted, rumors assessed. These were the hours of secrets, where alliances could shift, and trust was cautiously rationed. Shadows seemed longer at night, and with them came the creeping sense that danger was never far. There were practical duties, too. A medieval king often reviewed petitions or correspondence by candlelight. Wax seals cracked, parchment unrolled, quills dipped and scratched. The writing wasn't always done by the king himself. He had scribes for that. But he dictated decisions, issued responses, and weighed every word carefully. One poorly chosen phrase could ignite a feud or be used as a weapon in a rival's court. Then came the family. If the king had a queen, children, or mistresses, this was the time when personal life resumed, if only briefly. The royal family often dined privately in the evenings, a rare moment of informality behind closed doors. Laughter might be heard here, or tears. A king could be many things: ruler, husband, father, stranger. It all depended on the day and the burdens he carried. The private chambers were both a sanctuary and a trap. He might rest in a massive bed draped with heavy curtains and layered with furs. But rest didn't always mean sleep. Anxiety, chronic pain, and lingering illnesses made restful nights rare. Physicians might be called for sudden ailments. Guards paced outside, always armed, always listening. Some kings feared the night more than war. Darkness brought vulnerability. It silenced the distractions and left only thoughts. Dreams, if they came, could be haunted by the memory of battles fought, by the faces of men he had ordered to die, by the weight of a crown that never came off, even when he laid down to sleep. And in those restless hours, some kings found themselves wondering whether all their power truly made them free, or merely caged them more tightly in a world no one else could truly understand. It wasn't all battles and banquets. A king's daily life in medieval times involved an endless procession of rituals, councils, and the delicate dance of court politics. The royal court was more than just a place. It was an atmosphere, a theater of manners, maneuvering, and watchful eyes. Every person, from the highest noble to the lowest scribe, played a role in the drama of power, and the king was both the star and the prisoner of that stage. Each day began with ritual. The king's awakening, known as the lever in some courts, was often a semi-public event. Trusted courtiers and key officials attended the rising of the monarch, where they might discuss matters of state even before the king left his bed. Pages helped him dress, not just out of service, but because witnessing the king's morning routine reaffirmed his status and theirs. The garments themselves were symbolic: fine linen, velvet, or silk, adorned with embroidery and the scent of spiced oils. Once dressed, the king moved through a routine of audiences, petitions, and councils. There were decisions to make: disputes over land, judgments in criminal cases, responses to diplomatic messages, taxes to be considered, and appointments to be handed out. These decisions weren't made in isolation. The king was surrounded by advisors, his chancellor, his treasurer, military commanders, religious leaders, and favored nobles, all vying for influence. The council chamber could feel more like a chessboard than a seat of power. Alliances shifted. Words were weighed like weapons. A single misplaced comment could echo through the realm. Ceremonies also filled the calendar. Feast days, religious festivals, coronation anniversaries, weddings, funerals, oaths of fealty. Each event required careful staging, and the king's presence was central to all of them. These weren't optional appearances. They reinforced his divine right, his authority, and his role as the living symbol of the kingdom. The clothes worn, the gestures made, the prayers said, all were steeped in significance. Then came the moments of courtly life between the formalities: meals, music, hunting trips, private talks in candlelit corridors. These were the spaces where the most important decisions were often influenced. A jest made at dinner could lead to suspicion. A toast that excluded a nobleman might signal disfavor. Every word mattered. Every look could be loaded. The court was a living game, and the king had to play it constantly. And behind all of it loomed the ever-present threat of intrigue. A medieval king could never truly relax. Assassination, betrayal, manipulation, it all simmered beneath the surface. Poison in the goblet, plots whispered in dark corners, secret meetings behind closed doors. Loyalty was never guaranteed. A friend today could be an enemy by nightfall. So while kings might seem distant and powerful in the pages of history, the truth was more fragile. Every day was a performance, every interaction a test, and every decision a step along a path lined with daggers. To rule was to walk a tightrope above a pit of ambition, where falling meant more than disgrace. It meant destruction. By the time a medieval king reached his final years, the throne that once gleamed with power often felt more like a burden than a reward. The crown didn't get lighter with time. It got heavier. Not physically, of course, though the real crowns of the era were no featherweight ornaments. But in the mind, in the soul, the pressure compounded. Every decision made in haste, every treaty signed in blood, every rebellion quelled. These didn't disappear. They lingered like ghosts, whispering in quiet moments. Old kings weren't surrounded by peace. They were surrounded by legacy, and legacy was a fickle companion. Chroniclers scribbled down their deeds, yes, but those same pens could just as easily write slander as praise. The church watched. Nobles plotted. Foreign powers waited. And their own sons, sometimes their greatest pride, sometimes their most cunning enemies, circled like vultures with crowns in their eyes. As age advanced, the body began to betray the king. Stiff joints, failing sight, slower thoughts. In an era with no concept of retirement, A king ruled until death, or until someone made a move before then. And so many did. Kings were poisoned at feasts, smothered in their sleep, urged to abdicate by scheming wives or ambitious sons. And even when the transition of power was peaceful, it was rarely smooth. A dying king had to ensure his heir was accepted, his lands secured, his enemies appeased or crushed. That final winter of rule was often the most fragile of all. Even in relative peace, kings faced the relentless decay of their own bodies while trying to hold the weight of an entire realm together. Their days were slower, but no quieter. Doctors, well, medieval equivalents, offered leeches, herbs, or bizarre tonics. Priests murmured prayers, courtiers feigned loyalty while calculating the best timing for shifting alliances. And outside, peasants might be starving, taxes might be failing, or distant outposts might be falling to foreign hands. In those final days, a king might retreat to a favorite castle or monastery. There, surrounded by the carved stones of his legacy, he could feel both proud and haunted. Some tried to make peace with God. Others dictated last decrees, struggling to leave just one more mark on the world before they left it. The crown passed, as it always did. But the man who wore it faded slowly, like smoke after a candle's snuff. And behind him, the realm adjusted, barely pausing to mourn. Because the throne did not rest, and the business of kingship, like time itself, never truly stopped. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the long shadow of the keep stretched across the outer courtyard, a strange hush would fall over the castle. This was the quiet end to a long, structured day, a time not for action but for reflection, stillness, and the soft murmurs of routine. A medieval king's evening wasn't marked by celebration or leisure, not typically. It was a winding down, one done with caution and calculation. Dinner, the last meal of the day, had already been served. By now, the great hall had emptied, the platters scraped clean of salted meats, trenchers of bread, boiled vegetables, and watered wine. The flicker of torchlight played across tapestries, casting long shapes on stone walls, while the servants cleared dishes and tamped down the fires. The king, depending on his temperament, might have retired early or lingered in private quarters with his closest advisors. Whispers of unresolved politics or religious quandaries might still echo behind thick wooden doors. These final hours often belonged to routine. A quiet game of chess, a short reading from a psalter or illuminated manuscript, read aloud by a chaplain, a brief check-in with the steward to confirm the next day's agenda, petitions from landholders, decisions on justice, or the welcoming of foreign envoys. Rarely did a king simply relax. The crown did not permit the kind of idleness modern luxury allows. Before bed there were rituals, a cup of warm ale or mead to ease the stomach, the careful removal of clothing, often with the help of a squire or trusted servant. Garments were folded, boots removed and inspected, a robe or simple shift provided for rest. A king's bed was a large four-poster affair, high off the ground, with thick woolen blankets and fur coverings to keep out the chill. Curtains could be drawn around it, not for elegance, but insulation and privacy. Sleep itself wasn't always guaranteed. Pain from old wounds, indigestion from a heavy meal, or the incessant worries of war, betrayal, or plague could haunt even the most secure monarch. Some nights were interrupted by urgent knocks at the door, a fire in the lower ward, a rider arriving with grim news, or an unexpected death among the noble class. Rest came in moments, not hours. Outside the castle, torches sputtered low in their brackets, and the night watch paced the walls with slow, steady steps. The gates were barred, the portcullis dropped, and the drawbridge raised. Inside, the castle exhaled into darkness. For the medieval king, the end of the day wasn't an ending at all. It was simply the pause between the burdens of rule. The body may have found brief shelter in linen and straw, But the mind rarely slept. Not truly. And so, in the deep silence of stone halls and shuttered chambers, the king waited, not for dreams but for morning, for the weight of the crown to resume its place, for the world to stir again, and for duty to knock once more on his chamber door.